It's 8:02. So good morning, everybody, and welcome. It is a great pleasure and an honor, I got to say, to have the possibility of opening this webinar that we co-organized with the Policy Studies Institute in the framework of the UNCTAD initiative on enhancing structural transformation in key partner countries, or BRI. Our initiatives have been focusing on three economies: Indonesia, Sri Lanka, and Ethiopia precisely, drawing policy lessons from the Chinese economic rise and tailoring these lessons to the local condition and idiosyncratic challenges. Today, we will discuss the work that researchers at the PSI have carried on over the last months on industrial and trade policies, which are two interconnected policy areas particularly important to accelerate structural transformation in the current competitive global economic scenario in the wake of the COVID-19 shock, which we are still affected from. Let me stress how for our team at UNCTAD, it has been a great pleasure working closely with PSI during these months, during the last year. And in fact, Ethiopia and UNCTAD, and particularly our team in the Division for Globalization and Development Strategies, have been having a long history of cooperation. We've been working with the Ethiopian government during the preparation of the Growth and Transformation Plan #2 back in 2014. And in that occasion, we were trying to identify promising export opportunity linkages with domestic activities and adequate supportive policy package. At the end of the day, it's more or less the same kind of work that we are carrying on together, part of the work that we are carrying on together right now. And our common understanding of the primacy of industrial policy and of its close connection with trade policy in a globalized world economy is also reflected in many of our recent publications on industrial policy and economic transformation. Let me just quote a couple of these publications was involved on is the Recent Development Countries Report of 2014 and the Trade and Development Report of 2016. Such a policy approach has been successful in Ethiopia. Over the last decade, the country has made significant strides in development. Per capita GDP growth has been increasing at an annual rate of 5.1%, and in 2000, this average growth rate was almost 7%, 6.8%. And the GDP growth has been accompanied by substantial improvement in other areas, in healthcare access, in education, basic social services. Economic progresses have been going hand in hand with social progresses. Still, the process of transformation in the country needs to be completed. The growth in value addition has not, in fact, been fully reflected in employment creation. Productivity, especially in the manufacturing sector, remain low, and despite the emergence of providing niche production in the apparel, textile, floriculture, and airlines, for example, the economy remains largely undiversified. Furthermore, given the concentration of both women and men in low productivity work, there is a lot of potential productivity enhancing structural changes by expanding employment in higher productivity sector, so structural transformation stricto sensus in a sense, but at the same time, increasing productivity growth within this sector, and as I was mentioning before, in particular in manufacturing sector. This is precisely why the work that Kiflu and Berihu have been doing on trade and industrial policy respectively is today more relevant than ever to shape the Ethiopian policy agenda in the years to come and foster the achievement of both economic and social objectives. In fact, let me conclude my remark on this note. I firmly believe that in crafting innovative policy strategy for the future, we must overcome the traditional separation between economic and social policies and start thinking to the growth and social agenda as sticking together. Sustained economic growth, in fact, requires disseminating new technology and productive opportunities to wider audiences and to more people, rather than confining their use to a narrow elite. And analogously, better employment prospects reduce inequality and economic insecurity more effectively than fiscal redistribution alone. So industrial and trade policy can be think not only as an instrument to accelerate growth, but at the same time as a way to solve and to fix social difficulties and social problems. Now, without further ado, let me now leave the floor to the Executive Director of the Policy Studies Institute, which is our electronic host today, Professor Beyene Peteros, for his keynote address. For Professor Peteros, the floor or the video is all yours. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Fortunato, UNCTAD, the moderator, distinguished participants of the webinar, ladies and gentlemen. In my capacity as Director General of the Policy Studies Institute, Ethiopia, I welcome you to the third and final webinar on the South-South integration, sharing of policy experiences series, organized the United Nations Conference on Trade and Development. Today's webinar is on trade and industrial policies in the time of COVID-19. Trade and industry is a promising sector and has significant untapped potential for building a resilient and competitive economy. Ladies and gentlemen, despite strong economic growth, Ethiopia still faces major challenges in bringing about robust structural transformation. Growth without structural transformation is not sustainable and unlikely to create adequate employment opportunities. It is therefore important to have an appropriate policy response at all levels. On the focus areas of the Ethiopian 10-year perspective plan under the manufacturing industry relates to the need to increase the utilization of locally available inputs, strengthening the value chain, interlinkages, and interdependencies within the manufacturing industry. In addition to this, the plan gives due attention to attracting new foreign direct investment in large numbers into this. The plan gives into the manufacturing sector. On top of this, the government is making a renewed effort to join the World Trade Organization, taking the necessary steps to get the best out of the African Continental Free Trade Area and working hard to improve the country's trade logistics. When we put these pieces together, it is clear that the government is determined to speed up Ethiopia's structural transformation by strengthening its integration into the regional and global value chains. The increased fragmentation of production across new opportunities for developing countries like Ethiopia to industrialize the economies. If this is managed well with appropriate policies, it can speed up the process of structural transformation, support sustainable growth, and help in poverty reduction. In Ethiopia, if Ethiopia manages to industrialize and integrate into the global value chains, the tens of thousands of Ethiopians who risk their lives trying to cross the Mediterranean Sea in search of good-paying jobs can find opportunities here in their own country. Instead of them making risky journeys, the jobs can be brought to them in their own towns and cities. The simple low-paying, labor-intensive activities should be upgraded through the value chain so as to improve the earnings and the standard of living of the local workers. In all of these, the government's trade, FDI, and industrial policies will. One faster way to driving structural transformation in Africa would be to draw on experiences from other successful countries. In particular, peer learning in developing countries could play an important role given the similar challenges and opportunities faced by the South in today's globalized world. While many developing challenges, China, on the other hand, has made rapid progress over the past 4 decades, lifting over 700 million people out of poverty since 1978. China can provide a good point of reference for other developing countries when shaping their industrial and growth policies. The PSI UNCTAD research work aims to identify the key constraints to structural transformation, share experiences of partner countries of the Belt and Road Initiative, and start the dialogue on the relevant policies. Particularly today's papers will discuss China's experience in strengthening trade and industrial policies for rapid structural transformation. In conclusion, I hope that the papers presented here today will provide insights on Ethiopia's economic policies and their effect on economic growth and structural transformation. The findings from the papers and the discussions that follow can help inform domestic trade and industrial policies and help shape local conditions to improve Ethiopia's adaptation to lessons learned from China. And it's my sincere hope that the work we do here at PSI in collaboration with UNCTAD and other local and international partners will be used as impetus for policymaking in Ethiopia. Finally, I wish you all a successful deliberation of the webinar, and thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Peteros. First of all, for the work that you've been directing during these months and the cooperation, as I was saying before, and also for this keynote address, and for putting into perspective the work that Kiflu and Berihu have been done during these months in particular, and setting so nicely the stage for the discussion that will follow this morning. Let me now leave the floor to the first of the two authors of the paper that will be discussed their work, who is Kiflu Molla, who is a senior researcher at the PSI and has been leading in the past months the work carried on in the areas on trade, global value chains, and trade policy. I have to say that I've been following directly, I have the pleasure of following directly the progresses in the research of Kiflu during these months, and I highly appreciated the way in which he looked at the trade policy in a strategic way and to the gradual evolution of these policies along the process of development. So without further ado, I'm happy to leave the floor to Kiflu for his presentation. Thank you very much, Kiflu.
Thank you, Pepe. Thanks a lot. And thank you everyone for joining this webinar. And I'll be talking about Ethiopia and the global value chains and learnings from China. And as a way of introduction, in the past decades, we have witnessed increased fragmentation of production process across countries, and this has led to different stages of production processes being undertaken in different countries, and this has led to a rise in global value chains. And with this, we have also seen increased role of vertically integrated multinational enterprises and trading intermediates. For example, between 1990 and 2015, trading intermediates has increased almost 6 times, and this has been faster than the 4.5 times increase in other forms of trade. So with this, the notion of comparative advantage has shifted from comparative advantage in final goods to that in parts of the production process, and allowed developing countries to industrialize and boost their exporters by finding a niche in the value chains, in the global value chains. So in light of this, the main objective of this paper is to identify key challenges that Ethiopia is experiencing in taking full advantage of the processing trade or global value chains, and examine what can be learned from China's strategic approach to this. And when we move to the existing policies and challenges that Ethiopia is experiencing in processing trade and global value chains, the relevant policy determinants for this are trade and investment policies, industrial policies, and quality of domestic institutions and infrastructures, as well as the quality of macroeconomic policies. And I will try to briefly go through this. And in terms of trade and investment policies, these are like openness to trade and investment are important for successful participation in global value chains. Without open trade and investment policies, it's difficult to imagine participation in global value chains. And when we look at these policies in relation to Ethiopia, we see that the policies in Ethiopia are restrictive relative to countries in the region, and most importantly, compared to countries that use participation in global value chain as a central part of their industrialization process, like China and Vietnam. But Ethiopia's government has also been taking efforts to increase Ethiopia's competitiveness, trade competitiveness, by reducing trade costs, improving logistics and trade facilitation measures. This includes taking or implementing a comprehensive national logistics strategy. Government has also been working to create market opportunities through different preferential trade agreements. And as a result, Ethiopia has bilateral trade agreements with Sudan and special trading relationship with China and Djibouti. Ethiopia also enjoys tariff preferences under the generalized system of preferences in different countries, and it also has preferential trade access to India, Russia, South Korea, and Turkey. And although it was recently suspended, Ethiopia also benefits from the African Growth Opportunity Act of the US, and the government should work hard to reverse this. And Ethiopia enjoys the everything but arms arrangements with the European Union. And on top of this, Ethiopia is also a member of the COMESA and recently joined the African Continental Free Trade Area, and is also taking negotiations to accede to the WTO. And these things will create opportunities for Ethiopia to integrate into the regional and global value chains. And when we come to the industrial policies in Ethiopia, I will not discuss this in detail as Berihu is going to talk about it, but to give you some highlights, in around 2002-03, Ethiopia adopted a comprehensive agriculture-led, export-oriented industrial development strategy, and this has been implemented through different programs, SDPRP, PASTEP, and then the first 2 years of the Growth and Transformation Plan. And since it was not possible to solve the human capital, access to foreign exchange, and credit constraints that the country has been facing, government launched another longer industrial development strategy, and this industrial development strategic plan was implemented in 3 phases. And the aim of this strategic plan was to bring structural transformation through increasing the GDP share of the industrial sector from 13 to 27%. This was mostly achieved, but the share of the manufacturing sector was targeted to increase from 4 to 17% by 2025, and this was largely ineffective. And when we see the major programs of this industrial development strategic plan that are relevant to the manufacturing sector, we see that one of the programs is adding new sectors into the government's priority sectors. And this was considering the opportunities for global value chains and the country's resource potentials. And as a result, the government added biotechnology, ICT, and petrochemical to the list of important industries or priority sectors. The other program relevant under this industrial strategy was promotion of local and foreign investment. And for this, government looks into formulating comprehensive sector-specific FDI strategy. And for me, this is still lacking. The other program was Industrial Zone Development Program, and this has been undertaken as part of the building different industrial parks across the country. And this industrial strategy has been implemented in the last 2 years of the GTP1 and throughout the GTP2 period. And now recently, government has launched a 10-year development plan. And the main aim of this plan is to promote structural transformation by establishing a manufacturing-led economy where export-led growth and import substitution are given due attention. And the 10-year development plan, it also puts ambitious goal of increasing the share of the manufacturing sector and also increasing the share of manufacturing sectors in exports. For example, the plan is to increase share of manufacturing exports from 13.3 to 48.4. This is a 35.1 percentage points increase in 2030. And when we come to the performance of Ethiopia in terms of trade and investment, we see that Ethiopia has the lowest shares of trade and exports, even compared to sub-Saharan African countries. As you can see, Ethiopia is like at the bottom, being better only compared to Sudan and Nigeria. Part of this is due to Ethiopia's large size, but even compared to countries like Kenya, South Africa, and the like, Ethiopia has a very small share of trade and export in GDP. And when we look at the trend in trade share over time, although it has been increasing since the 1990s, it started to continuously decline after 2011. And in terms of export performance, although GTP2 has identified the export sector as one of the key drivers of economic transformation, in both GTP1 and GTP2 periods, the government has missed the targets. The red line is showing the target set in GTP1 period, and you can see that it is missed by a lot, and the same in GTP2 period, the green line, and the actual performance is declining over the years, especially after 2011. And because of this, also government has been taking different measures to promote export and narrow down the trade deficit. You can see that trade deficit in the country is widening with stagnant exports and increasing imports. And for this, the low industrial base of the country is accountable, or one reason, which leads to rapid expansion of imports and widening of the trade balance, and making it difficult to integrate into the global value chains. And in terms of FDI performance, we see that Ethiopia has been taking several measures to promote inflow of FDI into the country, and this has led to some increase in FDI inflows into Ethiopia. And as you can see, until 2017, Ethiopia has been getting a lot of FDI inflows. And this has a great potential to promote global value chain participation. But after 2017, the inflows of FDI is also declining, and this can mainly be attributed to the peace and security issues that the country is facing in these recent years. And coming to the challenges that Ethiopia is facing in promoting global value chain participation, the major problems are qualities of infrastructure and institutions, business environment, and peace and security. There are obvious problems. Openness to trade is also another challenge that Ethiopia is facing in this regard. Inefficient logistics and bureaucratic border and customs clearance are major constraints. The problems with infrastructure will also lead to higher trading costs, and this makes it impossible to integrate into the global value chains by reducing the low wage cost advantage that Ethiopia has. The other major problem or challenge that Ethiopia is facing in this regard is macroeconomic challenges. The high inflation and overvalued exchange rate of the birr, and the lack of access to foreign exchange to domestic firms is a major macroeconomic challenge that Ethiopia is facing. And on top of this, firms also face limited access to finance their investment and trade activities. And when we move to lessons from China in relation to processing trade, China started taking major economic reform measures in 1978 with the open door policy. And China started moving up the value chain in late 1990s. And in this, the role of policy and market forces has been very important. And China applied the Go Global policy in around 2001 when it joins the WTO. And after that, it used a host of policies in its 5-year plans to promote the integration of China into the global value chains and move up the value chain. For example, China invested in new infrastructure, promote science and innovation through technology parks by giving financial support and tax incentives for firms engaged in high value-added activities and industrial innovation. And in early periods, China used different measures to promote trade and investment. These are measures like local content requirements, trade and foreign exchange balancing requirement, export performance requirement, coupled with incentives. And China also applied mandatory joint ventures and technology transfer requirements. These measures have been abandoned later when China was about to join the WTO, and it relaxed these policies, and government gradually reduced its interventionist approach and used more of policies that promote competition, innovation, protecting patents and property rights. These are also requirements of the trade-related investment measures. And when we look into the role of policy in improving Ethiopia's participation in global value chains, we can think of, for example, to increase the integration of domestic firms into international production networks. Government needs to work hard to improve the quality of institutions and increase investment in infrastructures. it's also important to work hard in reducing the trade costs through trade facilitation, reducing tariff and non-tariff barriers through trade agreements, and also, and this is important because unless we reduce costs of participation in trade costs, participation in global value chain is difficult. And in relation to FDI policy, government needs to work hard on its FDI attraction and management by creating an enabling environment, and also by combining export requirements with incentives and strictly applying the rules. We have some kind of similar requirements when it comes to FDI like China, but mostly these rules are not strictly applied, and this is something that needs to be improved. Incentivizing joint ventures, vertical integration, and linkage between local and foreign firms is also important for technology and skill transfer. And these are policies that are missing in existing FDI policy in the country. And in terms of evolution of production capacities of national firms, the key policy will be investing in education and trainings, as these are key determinants of a country's ability to move up the value chain. And by promoting research and development and strengthening the link between industries and universities, it's possible to increase the ability or the capacity of the labor force and integrate or move up the value chain. The other important thing is upgrading the domestic upstream supply chain. We see that low capacity of domestic firms is one of the constraints for integrating into the global value chains, and developing countries in this regard face policy puzzle, whether to increase the foreign content, meaning the import content of exports, or the domestic content of exports is a policy puzzle for countries, because increasing import content of export is linked to global value chains, and domestic content of exports is not considered as integration into global value chains, but the literature considers these two as complementary, and the government needs to work hard to strengthen the upstream supply chains. Without this, it's difficult to fully integrate and move up the value chain. So finally, the take-home message from all this is that there is a lot that Ethiopia and other less developed countries can learn from China's success in integration into global value chain and moving up. However, these lessons cannot be directly replicated given China's unique nature, and the local context and conditions are different. And moreover, what was possible in 1980s, 1990s may not be practical for the current globalized world. But despite all this, Ethiopia can draw lessons from China's approach to industrial policymaking. For example, we can take lessons in terms of the need for gradually evolving policies. Policies that evolve given or taking into account the country's level of development and the global environment. It's also important to take into account the need for an active government policy intervention and improving the capacity of the bureaucracy in implementing its policies, and the commitment to implement the policies that government sets. There is also a need to, in addition to the interventionist policies of the government, it's also possible to use policy tools like incentive systems and provision of enabling environment to increase the integration of the economy with global and regional value chains and move up the value chain. And this is all I have, and thank you.
Thank you very much, Kiflu, for a fascinating and presentation, excellent way, very clear way, and also for keeping the time that was perfect. Before moving forward to Berihu's presentation, just a few points feed the discussion that will follow on. The first one, which is absolutely important, is what you mentioned towards the end, is the idea of upgrading along global value chain, which is somehow interrelated to education and training, what you have to offer to global supply chain. Because at UNCTAD, one of our core messages is that it's like for trade, participation to global value chain per se cannot be an objective for developing economy, but must be an instrument to accelerate development and structural transformation. As Professor Peteros was discussing before, you cannot have long-lasting development without structural transformation, but in order to do so, you have to try to avoid the trap of global value chain, which is remaining somehow trapped to low value-adding activities, and therefore upgrading and being very proactive in terms of policies to guarantee increasing capacity of local level to get this upgrading a value chain through time, it's extremely important. Of course, this is related to the graduality of the policy framework, the trade policy framework that is discussed in your paper that I mentioned before. The second point has to do with these 10 years development plans, no? the TYDP that you mentioned, and in particular the objective in manufacturing, which it's, as I was mentioning in my introduction, is extremely important to do more in that direction. Ethiopia is underperforming, one in terms of volumes and in terms of productivity. What is even more important probably is creating employment in the manufacturing sector. As we know, long-term development is related in particular to the growth of the manufacturing sector and to the peak obtained in the manufacturing sector, not only in terms of production and value addition, but to the peak employment. That was the story of the Eastern Asian tigers and before of the European countries. So that's extremely important to focus on employment creation in the manufacturing sector for men and for women, which is part of the work that we are doing also in the project and is one of the dimensions we would like to stress as well. The third point is very important, and again, it's one of these points that somehow link what we've been doing with the work that Berihu is going to present us, but is the industrial policy use of trade policy. It's extremely important, and we have to pay attention to the international agreement framework we'll live in. Now, the data that you show on trade in manufacturing precisely, that they show in Ethiopia rise in the early 2000s, and then a decrease right after, and is one of the reasons why the targets of GTP1 and GTP2 were not achieved, is also the fact that the new opportunities opened by the AGOA, and in particular by the fact that AGOA was not including rule of origins inside, made the African countries and Ethiopia in particular, some in a way a corridor for Chinese firms and for Asian firms to overcome and override the multi-fiber agreement. And when this multi-fiber agreement actually was phasing out in the mid-2010s, 2015, 2016, the trade went down. So we got to really pay attention to the international framework of agreement we are in to take advantage of the opportunity. We are mindful of the risk of this changing scenario. And in this sense, and probably we'll have time to discuss this in the second part of the discussion, regional opportunities and ACFTA that you mentioned in your presentation, I think will offer a way to circumvent and create sort of insurance against this kind of changing in the changing scenario of international agreement with other countries outside from Africa. But again, excellent presentation, as I was telling you before, was an excellent paper. I think has a lot of value and will feed in the discussion in an important way. Now, before opening the floor to the discussion, also to our discussants of today and to other participants of this meeting, let me introduce the second speaker of the day, who is Assefa Gebrehiwot, who is again another senior researcher at PSI and has been responsible for the workflow in these months on industrial policy, trying to identify the major constraints to structural transformation in Ethiopia and drawing lessons from the Chinese policy experience. So without further ado, I'm eager to look and to see the presentation of Berihu. So Berihu, please go ahead, the video and the floor are all yours.
Thank you very much, Pepe. Good morning, everyone again. Let me project my presentation. Okay, here we go. Can you see it?
Yes.
Okay. So thanks again. My presentation will be on Ethiopia's industrialization. It has some overlapping issues with trade, and we'll try to focus only on issues that haven't been discussed by my colleague Kiflu. So the objective is to discuss two issues. The first is what does Ethiopia's industrial policy experience look like? And what have been the challenges during the implementation period? And in terms of achieving the objectives set. And second, can we learn something from China to alleviate some of the challenges we have faced during the industrial policy implementation experience in Ethiopia. So those are the two issues that I would like to focus on. So the outline will be first to provide you with some policy discussions on Ethiopia, particularly focusing on industrial policy, and then take you to give you some of the key indicators in terms of macroeconomic indicators, structural transformation indicators, so that we know what has been achieved through the implementation of the policy, and then what are the major constraints right now facing the country, and then to draw on some lessons from China, if those can help boost Ethiopia's industrialization going forward. So very briefly, modern industry started in the early 1920s. Between 1920 to 1974, for Ethiopia was the emergence of so-called modern industry. Industries that are producing modern goods, manufacturing goods, and those modern industries were largely owned by foreign firms, foreigners. So that was a period when industry started to emerge in Ethiopia, and most of them were foreigners. The second period, from 1974 to 1991, I'm sure everyone knows this period, was a period of closed economy for Ethiopia, socialist government. The country entered into one of the most heavily regulated and closed economies in the world. The private sector almost had been decimated, and there was a protracted civil war. So the outcome was, a civil war combined with, a very closed socialist economy. The industrial sector almost died. And then came in 1991, a new government, and then the resurgence of the private sector started. So with the government, with the coming of a new government in 1991, the first period, 1991 to 2002, can be taken as a period of formative years, where the economy tried. It was a period of coming out from socialist government, and then taking reforms, opening the market, lifting restrictions, things like that. So the first period can be taken as a very formative period. And then from 2003 to 2018, Ethiopia entered into a very high growth trajectory. I call that period the high growth period. And then it started to feel, to face some vulnerabilities, because the growth period during the 2003-2018 was largely driven by public investment, factor accumulation, and some vulnerabilities emerged, like macroeconomic imbalance, accumulation of debt, and the weakening of the the external sector, inflation. So, those vulnerabilities started to emerge. And then this led to the coming of the homegrown economic reform to alleviate some of these macroeconomic imbalances since 2018. So basically, these are the timelines of the key timelines for Ethiopia's policy, starting 1990, 1920. Well, so if I go a little deeper into the period between 2003 to 2018, where Ethiopia entered into a very high growth trajectory. During that period, the main guiding policy has been the agricultural development-led industrialization. This policy provided a very broad policy direction for Ethiopia. It's not a very detailed policy that charts the process of industrialization and the interaction of the different sectors in the economy, but it provided a very broad vision and direction for the country, where it should start, where it should be going. And then in 2003 came the Industrial Development Strategy, which particularly focused on the industrial sector. And then it clearly defined the role of the agriculture. So how the two, agriculture and industry, need to be interacting and how one should feed the other. And then through the process, the issue of developing green industries also came to light in 2011. So as Ethiopia proceeds to industrialize, in fact, one of the lessons that Ethiopia might have learned from China is maybe, to start early on addressing climate issues. It will be costly to, the policy of grow first and then clean your mess later is something that Ethiopia somehow seems to have taken into account. And as I said, from 2018 up to now, the Hager Homegrown Economic Reform, which tries to address some of the key vulnerabilities in the economy. And then right now we have the 10-year perspective plan, which runs from now to the coming 10 years. And this builds on the previous plan, which is a GDP2. It has particularly a private sector focus, and it aims to bring massive structural transformation. That's the key objective. For example, it aims to increase the share of the manufacturing share in GDP to around 18%, which is now around 7%. So it's the objective is to strengthen to enhance the structural transformation of the country. Major industrial policy tools that Ethiopia has used so far. It has heavily invested in FDI, particularly attracting foreign firms into its industrial parks. That has been one of the major policies. And most of this industrial, investment attraction has been in the areas of export, firms that are capable of exporting. So it's highly export oriented. And also through this attraction of investment, it tries to develop domestic capability through technology transfer and learning. So what has been achieved? We'll give you some numbers to show that. Well, you can see that for the first table shows the economic growth performance, starting from the 1975. That is, a very small growth. For example, in between 75 and 92, around 1.7%. You can see the high growth period from 2003, 2004 to 2018, 18, 19. Ethiopia grew at an average rate of around 10.3%. And then you can see how this impacted the per capita income of the country. Right now, it's around 985. And in 2005, it was only 250. So Ethiopia is still poor. It's still a low income country with 980 USD per person, but from where it has come, it's a significant stride. And then you have the poverty levels also. You can see poverty was around 46% in 1996, and now it's around 22%. So again, we still have a lot of people under poverty, but the reduction has been massive. Okay, then we have also here export, the external sector. You see that there is still a significant imbalance between export and import. I'm sure some of these have been covered in Kiflu's presentation. In terms of sectoral shares, again, this is one of the important indicators of structural transformation. We still see the agricultural sector, having a dominant role. Also the service sector, until quite recently. In fact, it has surpassed the agricultural sector. The industry sector slightly growing, but it is still quite small relative to its peers, and also by the sub-Saharan average standard. If you also see it in terms of employment share, again, the agricultural sector is still the main employer in Ethiopia, employing around 76–75%. And then the service sector follows. The industrial sector employs a very small portion of the population, of the labor force. If you look at the productivity measured in terms of value added per worker, you can see a significant variation between the three sectors. There is productivity differences, which shows that there is still significant scope for structural transformation. Service sector, which is usually capital driven, seems to be highly productive here. And then the next sector is industry, and then you have the agricultural sector. So the main message here is the fact that there are significant productivity variations between these sectors shows that labor movement and other factors production need to move between sectors for the Ethiopian economy to structurally transform. So there is a significant scope in terms of that. So what are the major constraints and limitations? Macroeconomic constraints, right now, it is one of the major constraints. This include, there is severe balance of payments problems, largely stemming from the weak external sector of the country. And secondly, there is a persistent forex shortage and backlog, which is related to also, I guess, the weak external sector or the export sector. And also there is high inflation. And then also a related one is debt, the accumulation of debt. It's not that the debt is very high, but because of the weak export sector, Ethiopia's capability to service it is quite weak. In terms of structural transformation constraints, there is excessive focus on export, which is good because export is one of the problems of Ethiopia. But again, this has its when you look at it, the industrial policy, it has its own limitations because it doesn't allow firms, enterprises to experiment at home first and then go global. So, the fact that you have to set up your factory and immediately export is something very challenging for firms. So the idea of, allowing firms to do some experimentation first in the domestic market and then grow their capability and then go global would be, I think, one way to encourage firms. And then developing the manufacturing sector itself is quite challenging because it requires several and simultaneous interrelating investments that you have to do. It requires, heavy fixed cost in terms of infrastructure and setting up a lot of factory installations. It requires public infrastructure such as electricity and other transportation mechanisms. So there are interrelated and simultaneous investments that need to be made for manufacturing sector to be effective. If one of these is missing, and then you have a situation where the manufacturing sector stays stagnant. So that's the case in Ethiopia. Structural transformation constraints. The effectiveness of the industrial policy is challenged by policy consistency problems, and also implementation capacity issues, and also in terms of providing functional services. So there are policies that encourage firms to come to Ethiopia. For example, there are investment policies, and there are also policies that encourage domestic firms. Sometimes some of these policies are not consistent to each other. You want to encourage foreign firms to come, but that should not be at the expense of developing your domestic capabilities. So they have to be complementary. So there are issues of consistency that need to be figured out. And then, of course, implementation capacity remains quite a problem. For example, in terms of providing functional services, you have a lot of incentives and subsidies, but the way they are administered, for example, the one-stop services that are given to private firms in industrial parks, in other places, they are set up, but they are not really functional. So functionality remains to be challenged. And then, of course, there are lack of efficient transportation and logistics problems between Addis Ababa and Djibouti. The transportation cost is very high for Ethiopia, particularly the land transportation. There are inefficiencies there. There is a problem of generation of electricity, which lags behind the growing demand in Ethiopia. So getting connected to electricity, particularly if you are investing away from industrial parks, is still quite a challenge. Of course, poorly functioning backward linkage between industry, particularly FDI and local firms, is still quite weak. In fact, there are significant reasons believe that the problem of enclave parks could emerge in Ethiopia. Finally, so what can we learn from China? Well, China's development process, very briefly, can be seen in 3 stages. The first stage, which was the pre-1978 period, the pre-reform period, we can call it, what they call it the Great Leap Forward, was for China to invest heavily in heavy industries, particularly iron and steel. But of course, this was not a success. Definitely, it was a failure. But you will see that some of the things they have done during this period would help for later stages. Otherwise, this is the period where the Chinese have heavily invested in iron industry, but it was of less a success. The second stage started in 1978, start of the reform period, and it goes to 1999. This period is better known as balanced development period, where they focused in agriculture and light manufacturing. And this is the period where they have made significant strides. And this is the period I think we can learn, Ethiopia as a country can learn from this stage of development. The third stage is after 2000. And again, in this period, they continued the light industrialization or the light manufacturing industrial development, but they also came back to the heavy industry, which they started in 1953. And then because they had some groundwork that they have done in the 1953, it was easy for them to get back to this and then to revitalize their sector. So, so in 2 areas,
Sorry, Berihu, just I have to ask you to conclude because we are running out of time. I'd like to leave some time for discussion as well. So it's extremely interesting, but if you can wrap up and then maybe you can get back in the replies if you have time later. Thanks.
Sure. So the first lesson will be, for Ethiopia to boost its export, and this has to do with developing its SEZ in terms of infrastructure, management, and financing. And the second lesson will be in terms of developing capacity development, internal capacity, domestic capacity, so that it can link its enterprises to the FDI firms that it has attracted. And thirdly, the agricultural sector is very important. So its productivity must increase to support the urban development, the manufacturing development, because otherwise, if you don't do this, wages will increase, then Ethiopia will lose its competitiveness. So to conclude, issues that are related to manufacturing, structural transformation constraints need to be solved. And then you have the weak export sector. Again, there are significant challenges here that need to be solved in terms of logistics, infrastructure, exchange rates, and then the FDI local firm linkage, quite weak. And then you have a lot of work in this area. And finally, agriculture. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Berihu, for the excellent presentation and for all the work that you have done in these months, as I was telling before. An impressive work from all points of view. Just a couple of points before moving to our discussions. I like a lot the way in which you frame the story, the historical perspective, and then the description of the evolution of the strategy from an agricultural development-led industrialization to an IDS, proper industrialization development-led strategy, and the quest for the links that in part was feeding in the work that we have done back in 2014. I was mentioning before the idea of developing the manufacturing sector, but mindful of the linkages with the domestic economy and the agricultural sector, which is still dominant in the country. In that case, we are looking to non-food agro-processing, to the linkages between the textile sector and what you have in the economy, in the production you have from agriculture. The idea of the impact of this strategy, which again, it gets back to the point we were discussing before. It's one of the weaknesses of the impact of the progressive evolution of the strategy is being on the employment creation in the manufacturing sector, because these data that you show us are pretty impressive. You have been employment flowing out from agriculture, as you usually have along the process of structural transformation, and most of the employment flowing out from agriculture has not been going to manufacturing, but to the services sector. So that's somehow correcting these kind of flows and direction of flows is one of the aims for the future. The third and last thing I want to mention before opening again the floor to our discussants, giving the floor to our discussants, it's something which is something particularly important for us and SBI in the project. I particularly appreciate when discussing the challenges and the constraints that structural transformation and industrial policy face from Ethiopia's perspective. One of these, and the first one you mentioned, is macro, is the balance of payment, is the debt servicing that you are paying. Actually, this is one of the aims of our project, is looking at the structural transformation challenge in an holistic way, taking into consideration the fact that the different dimensions are always interconnected. So you cannot think, in a sense, to a proper industrial strategy and residential strategy without having in mind what is going on the macroeconomic side and the foreign exchange rate, as the case of Ethiopia and the challenge and the constraint presented and proposed by the balance of payment, for example, is teaching us, which is a lesson which is true for Ethiopia in a sense, is generalized for other countries which are facing analogous problem in this difficult context and other peer country and developing countries along the BRI. So without further ado, let me now leave the floor to the first of our discussants, which is Neva Makgetla. Neva is now a senior economist at TIPS in Pretoria, and she has vast experience in policy analysis in different areas, having been working along the years for the Development Bank of Southern Africa, for the presidency of the country, and for several other government departments. She has also been personally involved in this initiative, and in fact, she authored a paper on South Africa policy responses to COVID-19, focusing in particular on the weaknesses in terms of industrial policy responses before and after the pandemic, in a sense. So she is in an ideal position, I would say, to contribute with your feedback to the policy work that PSI is doing, and it is therefore a pleasure with pleasure that I leave the floor to you, Neva, please.
Thank you. And the papers were very interesting, and thank you for letting me hear them. But I do think they raise the issue of how do we think about learning from other countries? That is, what can we learn from success in countries that have very different circumstances and that industrialized in very different periods, as the papers noted? And I just want to start by saying, I think South Africa also tried to learn from China and from the East Asian industrialization experience generally, because that is, of course, although we don't really say so, that's really the paradigm for industrial policy. But I think what's important is we had a very different starting point, and arguably as a result, industrial policy hasn't achieved our core goals. So I want to look at you can look at the difference in the starting point in 3 ways in terms of the production structure that we have had for the last century, the class structure, and latecomer status. And I do think this issue of class structure is something I'd like to hear more from on Ethiopia as well. So if we look at the production structure, I mean, I would argue East Asia has actually been unique in the global South in the last 50 years. And that it's a problem that we tend to not look at where they started out compared to where we're starting out. South Africa has been long-standing dependent on mining. So half of our exports are from the mining value chain. Our other major exports are auto assembly and less visibly financed tourism and actually professional services. And we are an upper middle income country, which means that the GDP per capita and the manufacturing sector is already far more developed and productive than was the case in China when they started industrializing, and is now the case in Ethiopia. But the mining dependency does shape the nature of capital in South Africa. Nonetheless, 15% of our GDP already comes from manufacturing. But to give a sense of what that actually means in context, Ethiopia and South Africa together, our clothing exports are the equivalent of 1 working day of exports of clothing from China. So the scale is just tremendously different. We together account for 0.1% of global clothing exports. China accounts for 29%. Yeah? And by the way, our exports of clothing, we see clothing as a minor industry, but our exports of clothing are still more than twice as high as Ethiopia's, which gives you a sense of the importance of where your starting point is. If we look at ownership, South Africa also had very different structure of ownership. So I was listening to what you were saying about people moving off the farm into the formal sector. We don't have people moving off the farm because they were kicked off their farms under apartheid. So Black farming was smashed under apartheid. So we don't really have a peasant class, which makes us kind of unique amongst even upper middle income countries and largely explains high levels of joblessness. And that really contrasts with places like China or Ethiopia, where people can have young people going into manufacturing, earning less money, but it's part of a livelihood strategy for the farmers. For us, it's often the only income for the family besides government cash transfers. And that obviously places a huge amount of pressure on industrial policy, leads to a lot of deep inequalities and contestation over policy, which in turn makes it harder to mobilize investment. But our ownership structure is also, on the other hand, really different from China, not just in terms of agriculture, but across the economy. So the mining sector generated world-class companies in some industries, specifically mining, finance, and some services, with a combination of foreign and local ownership even before industrialization took off. So I should say even before the end of apartheid. So what you see in China and other East Asian countries is that the dominant firms grew with industrialization in conjunction with the state. We have a post-colonial economy where these companies see the state as foreign to a large extent. There's not those kinds of integral ties between the local and the foreign and the local economic and political elites, but also they're not in manufacturing and they're not that interested in going into manufacturing. I mean, the mining companies will say, you keep telling us to beneficiate war. That's like telling someone who has a cow they should go into leather production. It's a completely different industry. They can't do it. Whether or not that's true, but that is the kind of path dependency that makes it harder to industrialize in this context. And then finally, as the papers noted, like Ethiopia, we're latecomers. It means we have a really different access to global markets. The South African economy effectively was only able to export from the 1989 when the transition to democracy began. Before that, there was actually growing isolation on the world stage. And what you saw in that period was already the global north was seeing the threat from East Asia and beginning to erect barriers. So if the global north is actually seen as the consumer for all these global value chains. Once they start putting up barriers, it's much harder to get into that kind of export-oriented industrialization, whereas East Asia, even before China, Korea and Japan were industrializing during the Cold War, and they got special deals as a result of that. The other thing is when you talk about regional development, that because of the colonial era in Africa, there's a much, most of Southern Africa is low income. So the gap between South Africa and its neighbors in economic terms is much greater than the gap between China and its neighbors. So there's no ability to leverage regional infrastructure the way China could. So if you look at the GDP per capita in Southern Africa, it's 4-to-1 between South Africa and its neighbors, whereas with the other BRICS, it's less than 2-to-1. So we just don't have that regional market, and we don't have that regional leverage that you see in East Asia. And then finally, unlike Ethiopia, we're really far from markets in the north, and that geographic distance does make a difference. And we don't have any, and we're not near to, like I said, regional centers for capital and infrastructure like the Middle East or even Southeast Asia or Southern Asia. I'd really be interested in understanding more the ownership and financing of new manufacturing in Ethiopia and how that links up to being near to the Middle East, being near to India and Bangladesh, and of course the role of China and other East Asian countries. So I think what that says is that we really need to, think clearly about what it means to be learning from other countries and be, I think, more specific. That the learnings are a source of hypotheses, mostly around possible solutions. And that means, like any hypothesis, they have to be tested. In South Africa, we would say this is decolonization, that we need to take these things that were developed in other countries and say, but how do they fit in our country in a really, deep and serious critical way? I mean, what it usually means is that we look at these things that worked in a place like China. Underlying the policy solution is a diagnostic about the binding constraints on industrialization. That is to say, understanding the causal mechanisms in that country. If those causal mechanisms are really different like they are in South Africa, then the solutions won't work unless we really adapt them carefully to address those binding constraints. So for instance, in South Africa, we have world-class logistics infrastructure. Setting up SEZs as like they did in Vietnam with high-level infrastructure, because they didn't have the infrastructure anywhere else, is not actually going to attract a whole lot of capital because they can get that infrastructure anywhere. Yeah? Setting up SEZs is a place where you can get your problems fixed quickly. That might work. As a place with a sort of separate administration is a different thing. But the attraction of having an industrial site isn't there because we have high-level infrastructure across the economy, more or less. I also think that, by the way, in that context, we need to think more about what has changed with COVID-19. So nobody referred to COVID-19, but clearly it has profoundly changed at least global markets, and in many cases, domestic markets and domestic political economy. And I think we need to understand more about that and spend more time. Sorry, Pepe, but I did spend a lot of time on your paper, so there you are. And then the final thing is, I also think what this all points to is we need to talk about the political economic realities in our countries, rather than narrowly focusing on changing the production structure. That to get the policies through, we need to think about not just what are the sort of political views in terms of policymakers, but what is the base, who benefits from those policies, who loses, how do we manage the disruption to systems that seem to be functioning for many people? And as with any economic policy where change often brings concentrated costs to a few people, but the benefits are very diffuse in long run and people don't see them immediately, so you don't have mobilization in support of change. And I do think that in a place like South Africa, this whole post-colonial issue that brings profound inequalities, a different kind of commodity dependence, very unequal structures of ownership, and very unequal structures for building human capital as well, are things we need to look at much more seriously and consistently, because they really differ from countries where the colonial regime was very different, as in Asia. And China was, of course, never fully colonized. But the papers were very interesting, and I think we do need to have this kind of dialogue more often. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Neva. Fascinating comments, and thank you for joining us and for contributing. Just pick on two things which I think are essentially important. The last one that you said, it's critically important. You cannot think to industrial policy or even to trade policy without having into mind the political economic framework, what is implementable, what is doable given the political reality on the floor. And this is when we are not thinking in abstract to industrial policy, trade policy. We're not trying to find the optimal policy here. We're trying to find something which works given the context. So the transmission channel, so to speak, is extremely important. And the political reality, of course, is the key variable to look at here. We cannot think to industrial policy without having this in mind. And the second point, which is extremely important for Ethiopia, you mentioned this, is the geographical location of Ethiopia, which is amazing in a sense. North part of Africa, not that far from Europe, few hours flying difference, not that far from Asia, being relatively on the east side. And somehow Ethiopia is exploiting this. No, the Ethiopian Airlines, it's somehow coming out of this, recognizing there is some sort of strategic advantage there. Now, thank you very much again. We are running out of time, so let me go quickly to Anushka, to the second of our discussion today, which is Anushka Wijesinha, who is again the co-founder of the Center for Smart Future in Colombia, and is an economist which is specializing especially in trade, competitiveness, and innovation. He has a tremendously vast experience, I gotta say, looking at this. He's pretty impressive in government, private sector, and think tanks. And he has been working a lot with several international organizations, especially focusing, of course, on the Asian continent. And he has also authored, as Neva did, a study in the framework of this initiative. He has been working in particular on the study of global value chains and trade for Sri Lanka. And he's therefore certainly in a perfect position to comment on the analogous research that has been carried on here in Ethiopia. So without further ado, please, the floor is all yours, Anushka.
Thank you very much, Pepe, and it's a pleasure to join all of you, Kiflu and Berihu. Congratulations on a very interesting paper. That's the beauty of these collaborative or multi-country studies, that we get to read each other's papers and find interesting takeaways, in some similarities, some differences also. So let me actually start on that point with sharing a few. So my remarks will be selected, will focus selectively on certain aspects of the studies in relation to the Sri Lankan experience as well. But starting off, Sri Lanka has some similarities to the Ethiopian experience. For example, going through a substantial phase of socialist government and an inward-looking policy period. So Sri Lanka also had that prior to 1977, where there was somewhat of a failed experiment in import substituting industrialization, where there was a lot of pain on firms as well as households. And then Sri Lanka kind of had a whiplash shift to open economic policies, probably one of the first in the developing world, way back in 1977. Another similarity perhaps is also being in a strategic geographic location. Pepe just recapped that for Ethiopia. I mean, Sri Lanka has the same, of course, in the Indian Ocean region. Interestingly, though, in some ways, Sri Lanka is an anomaly because unlike Ethiopia, perhaps Sri Lanka, was part of the global trading system much earlier on, and in fact even earlier than China as well, so much earlier integrated into the global trading system. Interestingly, also an early participant in global value chains, global production networks, for example in the apparel industry, and later in the rubber products, and also in the electrical parts and components. And that participation in what I refer to in the Sri Lanka paper as GMVCs, global manufacturing value chains, make a distinction there. A big reason for that was FDI. So there was this initial view that part of that whiplash change, Sri Lanka doesn't have the domestic manufacturing capability. We tried to do import substituting industrialization, it didn't work. So instead, we're going to completely open up to FDI and try and integrate through that. So there was very ambitious, open FDI policies that were followed. at a very early stage, 1977, first wave, and then in 1990s. And in a way, this really helped to embed Sri Lankan firms into these global manufacturing value chains. But a big part of the reason for that, apart from open FDI policies, was the favorable climate that was on offer, and also, labor cost arbitrage. Now, over the years, over the decades, many of those factors have eroded, and simply having a relatively open FDI policy is no longer helping to, boost Sri Lanka's participation in these global manufacturing value chain. So I think that's something to talk about. Even though, I highlighted a few things that, Sri Lanka was an early starter in many of these, two major things happened since then. One was substantial policy backsliding, particularly on trade, becoming more inward, and also reforms that would have promoted domestic competitiveness, particularly domestic firms to compete on a level playing field, to upgrade, etc. Those reforms did not take place, whether it's on trade facilitation, whether it's on quality, on innovation, or the business regulatory environment. So kind of, it was a country to start off on a strong footing and then kind of stagnated, and now in a substantial challenging period. I now want to pick up a few themes that came out in the papers. It might seem ad hoc, but just ones that I found interesting. I think the role of agricultural transformation and the focus on that in the Ethiopia paper was, for me, quite interesting, because it's not often a topic we come across when we talk about industrial policy, but in the context of structural transformation, and it becomes important, particularly in Sri Lanka, because agricultural productivity, which is one of the themes explored in the paper under the agriculture part, agricultural productivity has lagged behind. So we still have about 30% of our population employed in agriculture, contributing less than 10% to GDP. So it's a kind of a well of unproductive employment, which it's hard to unlock into the industrial sector. And as a result, the industrial sector has labor shortages. Agriculture sector becomes kind of almost the sector where successive governments find it quite happy and comfortable to keep folks, this 30%, in agriculture for political reasons. Welfare can be politicized to this agriculture sector. It's a strong vote base, and so on. Another completely different theme that came out in the paper around implementation capacity in government. I think that's a big thing when we also consider potential lessons from China around calibrating policies, strategic trade or industrial policies. For me, COVID-19 has revealed a lot about what governments have the capacity to do and not do. And I think any lessons that we might draw from China around how to calibrate policies better, how to strategically implement trade or industrial policies, will be determined crucially by the implementing capacity in government. So I think thinking that some of these more, for example, strategic or staged reform efforts that China followed would be possible in some of our countries, I think, for me, is a big question mark. And then I guess it's a whole other discussion about, should we then even attempt to calibrate these policies and make mistakes, or should we completely have a laissez-faire approach? I don't know the answer to that yet, but I think it's a question worth asking in the context of what COVID-19 has shown us about which governments have better state capability to implement creative policies or not. Another point about that I picked up around the importance of openness to trade, it was highlighted in the Ethiopia paper also, and I firmly believe it's a prerequisite to participating in global manufacturing value chains. In the Ethiopia paper, it noted that this openness to trade is still restrictive. It's quite similar in Sri Lanka, surprisingly, because of that policy backsliding I mentioned earlier. And again, to link it to COVID-19, what we have seen is that measures that were taken at the onset of the pandemic as purportedly for balance of payments concerns, to prevent import surges or to protect foreign currency at the height of the pandemic and the crisis that followed, have now become de facto industrial policy, where those measures that were taken in a kind of an emergency situation have somehow morphed with various forms of industry lobbying, poorly thought out reasons why they should continue, how they should continue, heavy state role in deciding who gets to import what. So there is a concern for me that some of these policies ostensibly brought in during COVID are now become de facto industrial policies and not grounded in any even thinking around, will this help upgrade the sectors? Will they help upgrade domestic firm capabilities? So that for me is a concern. In the last few minutes, let me highlight 2 points. One is, a couple of points again linked to the point on COVID-19 and the role of...
Anushka, sorry, if you can literally take 2 minutes at most, because we are running out of time, that would be great. I'm sorry.
No, absolutely. The first is on regional integration. And I think, 2020 paper of UNCTAD, they had also said that for countries, developing countries that couldn't give massive fiscal bailouts, unlike, say, the global north, the role of using trade as part of a recovery strategy becomes important. And for smaller economies, but well regionally connected, trade integration, regional integration, for Sri Lanka, not just South Asia, wider ASEAN region becomes that much more important. And we're all seeing that this is possible because there is interest in FDI inflows to countries like ours that were earlier considered perhaps a little more expensive. But now in a COVID-19 context where it's not just about price, it's also about resilience, there is newfound interest in countries like Sri Lanka. Finally, a point around sustainability. So 2 quick points around sustainability. I think that's a new dimension that's coming in relating to COVID-19 and global manufacturing value chains. Countries that are seeking to participate in these more and more will need to consider the domestic policies and firm level adoption of sustainability. Finally, around servicification, I think we often talk about reforms in some of the traditional spaces of the economy, but thinking about service sector reforms, given the increasing servicification of these supply chains and the role that services play, I think many of our countries are not paying enough attention to whether it's financial services sector, technology services, etc., that need to also be reformed and looked at in the context of participating in these production networks. So I'll stop here. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Anushka. Really excellent comments. I think will fit in perfectly the work that they are carrying on at PSI and in general in Ethiopia. So thank you very much for being with us, sharing your experience and your view on this work. Just 3 points to highlight super briefly, and again, each of what we've been discussing today. Simple FDI are not enough. If we think to dynamic development and to effective introduction in what, especially in what Anushka was defining as global manufacturing value chain, not simply global value chain, which is an important point we've been discussing a lot during his work. The second, the issue of unproductive unemployment, which is released from agriculture, it is unable to move where it should. That is, we have to create employment in the manufacturing sector, and probably strategically inserting ourselves in global manufacturing value chain can be a way to move in this direction. And then third, again, and this making me think again to the point to the important point that Neva was doing before, the idea that policies have been implemented in Sri Lanka at the beginning of COVID-19, for some reason, they became permanent in a country. And this some reason are exactly the political economic framework in which you are operating in Sri Lanka. So we have always to have in mind that framework when we design policy. We cannot think to industrial policy without having in mind the political dimension, which is again an extremely important message, I think, for this kind of floor. Now, without further ado, we have very few minutes now. I have some questions from the floor that more or less they go in the same direction, because Jörg was asking about the role of potential regional integration, in particular in the case of Africa or ACFTA. Then we have another question from Bruno Antunes, who have been asking about the puzzle that Kiflu was mentioning today at the beginning of finding the right mix of domestic and foreign inputs and how to use trade and industrial policy in this direction. And somehow regional integration can help in this direction. So I would just ask to Kiflu or Berihu to take 1 minute and give a quick reply to this. So the potential role that you see on regional integration and how this can help to strike the right balance between domestic and foreign inputs on the way during the process of development. So we can start with Kiflu. It's really a flash, and then we'll go to the conclusion, and then I'll go to Berihu. Kiflu.
Okay, thanks, Pepe, and thanks everyone for your attention and for the comments and suggestions. And in relation to the role of the African Continental Free Trade Area in relation to increasing regional integration, I think it's going to play a major role for countries to strengthen their regional integration, like among African countries, and this is going to be a reliable source of trade for African countries, and they can also integrate their value chains internally in Africa, and this can create self-sufficiency within the continent while maintaining their integration with global value chains. The African countries can use the AfCFTA to integrate the regional value chains. And in relation to the domestic versus foreign inputs, I think it's important that countries develop their internal capacities to be able to use domestic inputs, and unless the local firms are integrated into the global value chains or in the integration, domestic countries or local countries in Africa or in other developing countries cannot benefit from FDI or global value chains. So increased use of domestic inputs is important to speed up the transformation in these countries, to industrialize and increase their domestic capacities. And that's important policy concern for Ethiopia. Enough attention should be given to local firms. Now, the attention is mostly for attracting and managing FDI for multinationals, but enough attention or equal attention should be given to local firms. Unless we increase their capacities, we will not be able to sufficiently integrate into global value chains.
Thanks a lot. Thank you very much, Kiflu, and thanks again for the work you've been doing during these months. We'll keep cooperating, I'm sure.
Thank you.
And now the floor for Berihu. Berihu, just your last minute, couple of flash comments, please.
Okay, thanks. Very great points raised by both discussants. Very interesting for all of us. On one point, on the point you, Pepe, also raised on the integration between foreign firms and local firms, that's an interesting area, because I mean the final objective, the objective is not to just attract, it's just to create an interaction, a kind of agglomeration where you have a lot of economic interactions and produce dynamic benefits. That's the final objective. So if you don't move towards that, then there is no point. The question is, how do you do it? You cannot use, for example, some of the policies that have been used in East Asia, for example, local content policy. I don't think it's relevant right now. You may have to move towards market-based, incentive-based systems where you encourage firms, both local firms and foreign firms, for them to interact. So something very, very forward-looking, very market-oriented, very incentive-based. Otherwise, this also relates to the issue. One of the discussants raised it was in relation to difference in periods and different in levels of income for the implications for learning. So I think that's my last point. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Berihu, once again for the work you've been doing. And as for Kiflu, I'm sure we'll keep seeing each other work together in the months to come. Thank you to everybody for this, for the participation to this meeting. I think it has been an excellent and productive morning, and full of very pragmatic discussion on policy, which is what we exactly did, and I think is particularly important for Ethiopia in this conjunction. Now, before leaving the floor to Professor Peteros for his concluding remarks, let me just say two things. One is just an housekeeping information. I would ask you to fill the form that it will pop up on the screen when this webinar will finalize. This will give us important feedback on the way we have organized this and how useful have been. The second one, let me just remember that our project, the project on enhancing structural transformation along with BRI, is approaching to an end. Last month, we will have a concluding meeting. We hope we will do that. We will manage to do that in a hybrid form, so part physical and part on a web platform. Of course, all of you will be invited and will share information shortly about this. And secondly, that in that occasion, we also plan to launch a volume that we have been producing on China's structural transformation. The title is China's Structural Transformation, What Developing Countries Can Learn. It is a volume that collects some of the critical policy lessons learned during these years, and that we hope to be useful not only for the 3 target countries of this initiative, but for all the developing countries which are participating to the BRI. So without further ado, again, thank you to everybody. In particular, big thank to Professor Peteros, host today, and the director of the PSI who has been working on the paper. So I'm happy to leave you the floor, Professor Peteros.
Well, thank you very much. First of all, I want to express my most appreciation for this kind of interactive forum created, perhaps driven by COVID-19 and the setting, the communication medium that we've been using is unique in its kind, and I suggest that these should be frequently utilized. And the very idea of learning from successful as well as concurrent experiences that are globally available, in particular in the South, that is the best way to go, so that we don't keep on making mistakes, and also aware of the fact that there are not blueprints that can be emulated and would work, in any country. So as latecomers to this question of integration into global value chains, I feel Ethiopia has a lot to do, and I appreciate my colleagues, Kiflu and Berihu, for their competent review, research, and appreciation of the cardinal problems that this country is facing. So I'm struck by one or two points that were brought up by the discussant. That is, okay, the Chinese experience is now being taken as universally. There is some interest taking that up by the developing countries, less developed countries. However, here, the Chinese experience of balancing agricultural and industrial development is extremely pertinent to Ethiopia, which is by and large an agrarian country. More than 85% of the population, is agrarian. Now the attempt to use idly the agriculture-led industrialization, which was extremely controversial, the last close to 20 or so years, and then the move to also paying attention to industry with a relatively recent kind of phenomenon in Ethiopia. The industrial development scheme to me appears to be rather extremely relevant, and I hope I promise that PSI will continue supporting this kind of interactive endeavors. Learning from peers is the best way to go, so that we don't keep on making mistakes by trying to find our way in the dark. Okay, thank you very much. I appreciate all the presenters, the commentators. I've learned a lot and opened my eyes, and so when we support Kiflu and Berihu's kind of research, we know why it is important. Thank you very much.
Bye-bye. Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Okay, bye-bye. Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.